They don't talk about it much. They don't put a label on it. But when things go wrong, when others start to panic, people who grew up in the 1970s often remain standing. This isn't a coincidence. It's conditioning. This is why growing up in the 70s taught people to handle stress in a way few other generations ever did. For children growing up in that era, stress wasn't something that appeared occasionally. It was ambient. You didn't grow up in a protective bubble. You grew up surrounded by adult tension, money worries, work exhaustion, marital strain, economic uncertainty. These things weren't hidden behind careful conversations or child-friendly explanations. They were simply their children, absorbed it all quietly. And when stress is present early, without being dramatized, the nervous system adapts. 70s kids learned early on that stress wasn't a signal to stop life. It was just something life happened alongside. What made this different wasn't just the exposure to stress, it was the absence of instruction. No one sat down to explain what stress was. No one taught coping strategies. No one walked children through emotional regulation. You weren't guided through it. You were left inside it. That forced the brain to self-organize. Children learned to observe, adapt, and endure. Stress became something to manage internally, not something to outsource to others for a solution. This is one of the deepest psychological roots of stress tolerance. Another subtle but powerful lesson of the 1970s was modeling. Adults were stressed, but they rarely collapsed. They went to work. They handled problems. They kept their routines going. Children watched this. They learned that stress doesn't automatically excuse you from responsibility. Now, that doesn't mean adults always handled stress healthily, but they handled it functionally. And children internalized that functionality. Stress didn't mean everything stopped. It meant you adjusted your approach and continued moving forward. Modern stress often escalates because it's constantly acknowledged and validated. In the 1970s, stress was rarely validated verbally. You weren't told, this is hard, or this is overwhelming, or you shouldn't have to feel this way. Instead, the message was unspoken but consistent. This is life. You'll deal with it. This forced children to normalize their internal discomfort. They learned not to interpret stress as danger. That is a critical distinction, because stress itself isn't necessarily harmful, but the panic around stress is. 70s kids also experienced regular physical discomfort, heat, cold, hunger, fatigue, minor injuries. These weren't treated as emergencies. They were treated as inconveniences. This trained the nervous system to tolerate discomfort without sounding an alarm. When the body learns that feeling bad isn't catastrophic, the mind follows. As adults, this translates directly into emotional stress tolerance. They don't immediately escalate internal tension into a full-blown crisis. They've already learned the powerful lesson. I can feel bad and still function. That is the very definition of stress resilience. One of the most overlooked stress-training mechanisms of the 1970s was boredom. Long, unstructured stretches of nothing. No constant stimulation, no easy distraction, no quick escape. Boredom isn't neutral. It actually creates low-level psychological stress, and 70s kids lived inside it regularly. They didn't learn to eliminate boredom. They learned to endure it. This matters deeply because stress often feels like boredom's louder, more aggressive cousin. People who can sit with boredom can also sit with anxiety, pressure, and uncertainty without imploding. They don't need instant relief because they know that discomfort eventually passes. Finally, in the 1970s, problems didn't resolve instantly. If something broke, it stayed broken for a while. If someone was upset, that feeling lingered. If something went wrong, you waited. This taught the concept of delayed resolution. Stress didn't come with an instant fix. So, children learned patience under pressure. They learned how to exist inside unresolved situations. That skill is incredibly rare today, and it's one of the strongest predictors of true emotional resilience. Ever wonder why some people just seem calmer in a crisis? Let's take a trip back to the 1970s to understand why. Back then, life had a different rhythm. Authority was clear, rules weren't really up for debate, and decisions were made for you. Boundaries were firm. This might sound restrictive, but it actually did something amazing for a kid's brain. It reduced cognitive stress. You weren't overwhelmed with endless choices or the constant burden of making decisions. This clear, even strict structure made life predictable, and predictability is a powerful antidote to uncertainty, which is one of the biggest stressors we face. Now, emotional support wasn't as readily available as it is today. Kids in the 70s learned early on not to expect an emotional rescue squad every time they felt overwhelmed. They didn't run to an adult with every little problem. They learned to sit with the feeling, to push through it. This doesn't mean they didn't feel stress. It just means they didn't always externalize it. This forced them to develop internal coping mechanisms. Some were healthy, some weren't, but they were all effective when the pressure was on. Think about it. Stress education didn't exist. There were no workshops, no common language, no deep analysis of feelings. Stress wasn't something you talked about. It was something you handled. This had a fascinating side effect. Stress didn't become part of your identity. People didn't see themselves as stressed people. They saw stress as a temporary situation they had to navigate. That distinction is huge. When stress becomes who you are, it gets bigger. When it's just a situation, it stays manageable. One of the most valuable lessons 70s kids learned, without even realizing it, was the difference between pressure and panic. Pressure was a constant part of life, but real panic was rare. Emergencies were actual emergencies. Everything else was just pressure. This calibrated their nervous systems. As adults, they don't escalate quickly. They can instinctively tell the difference between this is uncomfortable and this is dangerous. It's why many people who grew up in the 70s often appear calm during chaos. They're not cold or detached, they're calibrated. Their stress response threshold is simply higher. They don't activate fight or flight for minor threats, conserving their emotional energy for when it really counts. But this ability came with a price. Many from that generation tend to downplay their stress, ignore their limits, and delay asking for help. They handle stress, sometimes a little too well, to the point of normalizing overload. Stress was never framed as something that deserved attention, only endurance. This is why modern stress can feel so different to them. Today's stress is loud. It's constant alerts, continuous urgency, and endless emotional stimulation. Kids from the 70s often struggle, not because today's stress is necessarily worse, but because it's so much noisier. They're used to stress being a quiet, functional part of the background. Modern stress can feel performative and uncontained. The reason growing up in the 70s taught people to handle stress isn't because life was objectively harder. It's because the stress they experienced was repetitive, normalized, and largely unprocessed. That constant low-level exposure trained the nervous system, almost like weight training, gradual, consistent, and without any celebration. They didn't beat stress, they integrated it. They learned to move forward with it, which is perhaps the deepest form of resilience. So why does this all matter today? In a world that's increasingly uncomfortable with discomfort, this generation often stands out. They don't typically dramatize pressure, they don't crumble easily, and they don't expect constant relief. They learned that stress is a part of life, not a sign that something is fundamentally wrong. Growing up in the 1970s didn't make them immune to stress. It taught them how to carry it quietly, functionally, and without letting it define them. And in a world that panics so easily, that quiet ability often looks a lot like strength. Do you feel the same way? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe, and we'll see you in the next video.